And now we come to Genesis chapter 19 in the study of the life of Lot and the importance of separation. And young people, if you wanted to consider a chapter where we can really appreciate what it means to develop spiritual values, if you wanted to look at a chapter in the Bible where we wanted to see highlighted for us the importance of making smart decisions, a chapter that demonstrates for us the goodness and the mercy of our God, Genesis 19 is a wonderful start. And young people, God willing, over the next two classes, we're going to see this chapter as a chapter that's full of contrasts for us to consider. There's contrasts between Lot and Abraham, between Sarah and Lot's wife, between good and evil, hope and destruction, between the goodness and the severity of God. And as we work our way through these verses together, hopefully the exhortations are going to cause us to look internally, to see who do we align with in the characters that we'll look at together. When we pick up in Genesis 19, obviously a lot has transpired since we last left Abram and Lot back in Genesis 13, with Lot heading east towards Sodom. And I know a lot of the events that kind of transpire in between that we'll go through in the workbook discussion groups. We just want to highlight a few key aspects that we don't want to lose sight of before we jump into Genesis 19 together. In Genesis 14, you'll remember from the workbook, it's all about the battle. It's about a battle that takes place between multiple kings and kingdoms, and yet tied up in this, we find Lot. And Lot is taken captive. He's led away from Sodom, and Abram hears the news. He rushes out to save Lot and his inhabitants. Abram goes out with his trained servants, all of his household, to rescue Lot. But even after being rescued, sadly, we see Lot's decision to go back down into Sodom, leaving Abraham once again. And it appears that Lot saw no harm in associating with Sodom, so long as he left their wickedness alone. And while Genesis 14 records the first instance of God intervening for the sake of Lot, we know that he still goes back down to Sodom and Gomorrah. Let's come back in our Bibles to Genesis 18 to begin together tonight. We just want to walk through the breakdown of the events that lead us into Genesis chapter 19, and then we'll open up for more detail. If you'd like to take notes in your margin, just my kind of section breakdowns, here's just a suggestion for you, starting from about the middle of chapter 18, because we see obviously that the events that kind of lead into this section in Genesis 19 really begin with Abraham first being warned of the judgment that's going to come upon Sodom. The angels come to visit Abraham, and they tell him of the judgment that's going to come upon Sodom and Gomorrah. And of course, his first thought is for Lot. And so he pleads with them to save the righteous in that city. And of course, we know what happens in the record of what we've just read in Genesis chapter 19. The angels come down to Sodom at even. So let's come now to Genesis 19, because here we are introduced in the record once again to Lot himself. It says, "And there came the two angels to Sodom at even. And Lot sat in the gate of Sodom, and Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. And he said, Behold now, my lords, turn in, I pray you, into your servant's house, and tarry all night. Wash your feet, and you will rise up early and go on your way. And they said, No, but we will abide in the street all night. And he pressed upon them greatly. And they turned in unto him, entered into his house, and he made them a feast, and did bake unleavened bread, and they did eat." So we begin with the two angels that left Abram, entering Sodom at even. Now just look at Genesis 18 and verse 1. Look at how this chapter began. "And the Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day," speaking of Abraham. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed himself down toward the ground. It's midday when the angels pay a visit to Abraham. And in Genesis 19 and verse 1, it's now the evening of that same day as they descend into Sodom. And we have 2 men, both sitting, but in 2 very different places. Abraham at the tent door, Lot at the gate of a wicked city. And these 2 verses lead to 2 very different circumstances, as we see in the chapters that follow. Abraham was to receive a message at that time of hope, of a promise. Lot was to receive a message of destruction. And a great verse to put in your margins, just beside Genesis 19 and verse 1, is Isaiah 17, verse 13 to 14. Because that's where we see that eventime is used in reference to a time of trouble. It's a time of judgment upon nations, and in the morning, it says, those nations will cease to exist. That's Isaiah 17, verses 13 to 14. And so the angels approached this city at even to find Lot sitting in the gate of the city. It's the place where the elders, the judges of the city, would sit and minister to those that would come in. And so here is Lot, involved in civil society, sitting in the gate of Sodom. And we would associate certainly Lot with being a judge. He's a leader in Sodom from this description, and certainly from the title that was read to us in verse 9, from the people of the city. They call him a judge. But what we're starting to see clearly in the life of Lot is that it's been a slow, gradual decline. It's unfortunate to see in the life of Lot, but it's fortunate for us because we can read it, we can study it, and we can ensure that it doesn't happen in our lives. And really what we see is this decline in Lot happened in 6 different stages. It starts back in Genesis 13 with the strife. The strife between herdsmen. The inability to separate these 2 to maintain one camp in one area. And then, of course, Lot lifts up his eyes. He beheld the well-watered plains of Jordan. He chose him what direction to go. He pitched his tent towards Sodom, and then in Genesis 14, he dwelt now in Sodom, and here he is, sitting in the gate of Sodom. No longer in a tent, but in a city. And this slow, gradual decline can be the same for us, can't it? Often it starts with just a single step. One bad choice, one bad decision, one bad action. And we find ourselves in the city of Sodom. So when we come to Genesis 19 and verse 1, we are in the culmination of that gradual decline that Lot's been going through in his life. And really, as we go through these early verses, we come to see Lot in a way that leads us to believe that he was conflicted in his mind. Look at his words to the men in verse 2. Did you get the sense of urgency as we read through those verses? He wants them to be in Sodom for the least amount of time possible. You can come in, stay with me, first thing in the morning, you're out. He wants them gone. And what we're going to see is that, unfortunately, Lot should have been taking his own advice. But he just couldn't do it. Lot directs these men in a way that he should have been directing himself, and it can be the same with us, can't it? It's a bit like the mote and the beam for us in our own lives. We can direct others quite easily in a way that perhaps we should be listening to ourselves. Well, the 2 men, these 2 angels, they first push back at his offer. But it says that Lot pressed upon them greatly. That word press, it means to peck at or to urge. And if you want to get a visual, just watch my son Ethan tomorrow when he wants to play foosball. Constant pecking. And that's what he was doing here. Lot was resilient. He wouldn't let them stay in the street, even if it meant bugging them to the point of annoyance. But there's genuine sincerity, there's concern in the words of Lot here. Perhaps he knew just how easy it was to get sucked in and to lose everything in this city. Certainly he knew the evil that would take place in Sodom at the evening hours, and he will not allow them to stay in the streets. He will not allow them to stay by themselves in the evening in this city. Growing up, my mom always had a familiar phrase. Anyone that would come over would remember it. Anytime we take off for the evening, or we go out even to CYC and we'd have plans afterward for something, she would always just, right as we're leaving the door, she'd say, "Don't forget, nothing good happens after midnight." And Lot here has a similar mentality. They cannot be out late in this city, because under the cover of darkness, the evil presents itself. Well, the men obliged, these two angels obliged to come and to stay with Lot, and we see the hospitality that Lot shows to them in verse 3. We read that he made them a feast, it says. He makes unleavened bread for them. Now, it's interesting, this is actually the first instance in the Bible of unleavened bread. It's what Lot made for the angels that came to stay in his house. And if you actually just want to turn over to the next reference we have of unleavened bread, you start to see some of the connections. Just turn over to Exodus chapter 12. Just consider what Lot is attempting to do, what's going to happen in the morning, the importance on getting out. The next reference we have in Scripture to unleavened bread after Genesis chapter 19 is Exodus 12, beginning in verse 8. It says, "And they shall eat the flesh in that night, roast with fire, and unleavened bread. And with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Eat not of it raw, nor sod it all with water, but roast with fire, his head with his legs, and with his purtenance thereof. And thus," verse 10, "And ye shall let nothing of it remain until the morning. And that which remaineth of it until the morning ye shall burn with fire. And thus shall ye eat it, with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, your staff in your hand, you will eat it in haste. This is the Lord's Passover." Get ready to leave is the lesson that comes out of the unleavened bread. And here Lot should have been taking his own advice. The Israelites, hundreds of years later, would eat of this unleavened bread, and they were prepared to leave early in the morning to get out. And they waited as the angel of death passed over their homes. And here now is Lot with the angel of death present with him in the house, come to destroy a city. That's why they were there. And he makes unleavened bread, needing to be prepared to leave before they would bring the destruction upon the city that he called home. And just a note, Psalm 34:7, just down at the bottom. That's where we read of the angel of the Lord who encamps around those that fear him and delivers them. And certainly Lot was about to need that very same deliverance. But this was not to be a quiet night in Sodom. This was not to be a quiet night. This wasn't going to be an easy exit for Lot and his family. Because the evil of this city was about to present itself at his front door. Just pick up in verse 4 of Genesis 19. "But before they lay down, when the quiet would have started, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round, both old and young, all the people, from every quarter. And they called unto Lot, and said unto him, Where are the men which came into thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them. And Lot went out at the door unto them, and shut the door after him, and said, I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly. Behold, now I have 2 daughters which have not known man. Let me, I pray you, bring them out unto you, and do ye to them as it is good in your eyes. Only unto these men do nothing, for therefore came they under the shadow of my roof. And they said, Stand back. And they said again, This one fellow came in to sojourn, and he will needs be a judge. Now will we deal worse with thee than with them. pressed sore upon the man, even Lot, and came near to break the door. 5 times in verse 4, it's highlighted who it was that came to Lot's door. The men of the city, the men of Sodom, both old and young, all the people from every quarter. The famed sins of this city are revealed and displayed in all their ugliness to the angels. And let's not kid ourselves. This was a city's mindset. That's why it repeats that 5 times in a single verse. It wasn't just a select group. It was everyone. This wasn't just a few individuals. This was a practice that was shown by all. It was the men of the city, the men of Sodom, old and young, all the people from every quarter. And their evil desire to know these men, it wasn't a wholesome request. It's actually shown to be the lowest form of moral perversion in the book of Leviticus. Their request. And we see just how God viewed this city and their way of life in Genesis 13 and Genesis 18, and those references are on the screen. The men of Sodom were wicked. They were sinners before the Lord exceedingly. The Lord said, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous. Just turn over in your Bibles to Isaiah chapter 3. Because Isaiah chapter 3 again lays out a reference for us that speaks to the wickedness of this city. Isaiah 3 and verse 9. What's the attitude that these individuals in Sodom had? It says there, the show of their countenance doth witness against them. They declare their sin as Sodom. How did they declare it? They hide it not. Woe unto their soul, for they have rewarded evil unto themselves. What does that mean? They hide it not. They were open with this way of life. No desire to change. No need for direction or guidance, especially from a God. No care that others knew. And here they are at Lot's doorstep. And while this great commotion is taking place, Lot has these 2 men, these 2 angels in his care inside his home. And we read how he leaves the comfort of his house to address the mob that's formed outside. It's Josephus who tells us that Eastern custom at this time was that a man who took in a stranger was bound to protect him with his own life if he needed to. That's how serious a thing it was to take in a stranger. They are now under Lot's care. And so Lot, with the 2 men in his house, goes out to rebuke the gathering that's come outside of his own home. And in verse 7, it's the first words recorded by Lot spoken against the city. I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly. It certainly falls in line with the New Testament reference we have to Lot, one who vexed his righteous soul over their unlawful deeds. And here he is speaking out against the evil that was going on in the city. And yet on the heels of verse 7, we have verse 8. And there's 2 ways we can look at this verse. It's a tough verse at times to read. What's meant? There's 2 ways that we can interpret verse 8. The first would suggest that this was to be taken literally. That Lot, in an act of desperation, was offering his 2 virgin daughters to these men. Certainly would have taken a strong moral compass to protect strangers over your own daughters. So the thought is that perhaps this shows either how much Lot was influenced by Sodom, or that he knew the evil in his daughters' hearts. But there's another way that we can read this verse. And that's that this was not an offer by Lot. This was a rebuke. This was a reproach to show the men of Sodom just how far their conduct had fallen. This isn't what they want, anyways. And Lot knew that. And the support for that really is in the response that they give to Lot in verse 9. They accuse him of being a judge based on that very comment. They viewed verse 8 as a rebuke. You're judging us? And it seems to fit, certainly, the context of verse 8. Lot stating how these men came under the shadow of his roof. His house was a refuge for those who did not wish to partake in the sins of Sodom. Lot was protecting those in his house, and that includes his daughters. Well, the mob outside is obviously not very pleased with Lot. They appear tired of his involvement in their actions. In verse 9, Lot is acting as a judge against them. The word judge in verse 9, it means to condemn or to pronounce a sentence. And just notice the language that's used in verse 9. If you take out the italicized words in verse 9, it simply says, they said, stand back. And they said, this one came in to sojourn, and he will need to be a judge. This one. The singularity used here shows that Lot alone is the only one who stood in their way. The only one who was challenging their behavior. While many of them might have gone down with Lot into Sodom, just this one stood in their way. Lot alone. And of course what we see is that his sentiment of addressing them as brethren in verse 7 is not reciprocated. And so at this response, the angels that are visiting with Lot have seen enough. The situation has escalated past the point where Lot can keep them away any longer, and so we see that they now take action in verse 10 and 11. It says that the men put forth their hand and pulled Lot into the house and shut the door. And they smote the men that were at the door of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves to find the door. You ever noticed, young people, the use of a door in Scripture? What was it that separated those in the ark from those outside? Just a door. A few inches of wood separated you from life or from death. Can you imagine just a few inches? It's like what Brother Steve took us through in his devotion. It might just be a few inches that separates us from life or from death. And here they shut the door to try to protect those in the house. And it was just a door that separated them. And what we see here in verse 11 is that the physical becomes an allegory for the spiritual. These men were spiritually blind, walking in complete darkness, and so now physically they were a perfect match. And contrasted to them, we have Lot. His name, of course, means a veil or a cover. And his eyes are now open. He now sees firsthand the power of the men that he has welcomed into his home. And having taken care of what was outside the house, the attention of the angels now comes inward to Lot and to his family. There's a quote that says, you need to get the inside onside before you go outside. And Lot didn't do that. Those inside of his house will see some were lost. He focused too much attention on the outside, he'd lost what was inside. So the angels now have to get to work. They now turn their attention to those they can save, to Lot and to his family. And in the next few verses, we see highlighted for us God's concern for his family. Let's just finish off our section, verse 12. The men said unto Lot, hast thou any here besides? It's almost as if they're saying, is this it? Son-in-laws, thy sons, thy daughters, whatsoever you have in this city, you bring them out of this place. For we will destroy this place. Because the cry of them is waxing great before the face of the Lord. The Lord has sent us to destroy it. And Lot went out and spake unto his sons-in-law, which married his daughters, and said, up, Get you out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city. But he seemed as one that mocked unto his sons-in-law. There's no more time for investigation. There's no more time for explanation as to the wickedness of this city. The angels had seen it firsthand, just how bad it was, and so they now turn their attention to Lot and his family. Here was the opportunity for the righteous that Abraham had pleaded for. It was now their opportunity. Now, of course, we can see on the screen that those that Abraham pleaded for were accounted for. Whether you subscribe to 2 daughters or 4, it doesn't matter. There were righteous in this city. And of course, the attention now turns to them. And just a note on that word, whatsoever, in verse 12. When the angel said, and whatsoever thou hast in the city, it's actually best rendered, and it is properly rendered in the RV and the ESV, as whomsoever. Not whatsoever, but whomsoever. The importance is on the people, not the personal property. The angels could care less about that. Not what can you save, who can you save? And so Lot spends the night trying to save those that are dear to him. He would talk about the impending judgment, the need for repentance, the required action to be saved. And yet he's met with mockery. His sons-in-law, in verse 14, they think it's a joke. You know that Lot's wife didn't really want to leave Sodom. It appears that his daughters only leave because of Lot, and of course Lot himself lingers until the morning. So what are we being told, young people? For some, it was too late. It was too late to try to educate. It was too late to try to teach them of the need for repentance, the impending judgment, and the action that was required for them to leave. The time to go was now. If you weren't ready, if you hadn't taken it seriously, you were going to be left behind. What about us? Have we taken it seriously? Are we ready? We don't want to be left behind. So we read in verse 15. It says, and when the morning arose, then the angels hastened Lot, saying, arise, take thy wife, thy 2 daughters, which are here, lest thou be consumed in the iniquity of the city. And he lingered. The men laid hold upon his hand, and upon the hand of his wife, and upon the hand of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful unto him. And they brought him forth, and set him without the city. The angels in verse 2 were instructed by Lot to be on their way by the morning. How fitting that Lot has to take his own advice. It's decision time for Lot and for his family as the morning approaches. Would they serve sin just for a season? Or would they look to leave this wickedness behind, choosing rather to be strangers and pilgrims, choosing to be members of God's eternal family? And that's the same for us, isn't it? The same choice that faced Lot and his family faces us in our own lives. Will we be tangled with the world around us, unable to truly flee and leave it all behind? Will we be swept away with the allure that the world seemingly can offer to us? The money, the career, the sexual immorality, the time-consuming hobbies. You cannot serve 2 masters. A decision must be made in our lives. Will we be lovers of pleasure or lovers of God? The word for morning in verse 15, it means the dawn, like the dawning of a new day. And this was to be a new day. It was a new day where judgment and justice would reign, where both the goodness and the severity of God was about to be shown upon Sodom and Gomorrah. Your minds have probably gone to a few different places with the dawning of a new day. Malachi 4 speaks of the appearance of the Son of Righteousness. Luke 1, reading from the Net version, says, because of our God's tender mercy, the dawn will break upon us from on high to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet in the way of peace. That is what the dawn signified for Lot and for his family. And this is what we look forward to in the age to come. Well, back in verse 15, we can learn a little bit from the sentence that we read from the angels spoken to Lot. When they say, arise, take thy wife and thy 2 daughters which are here, lest thou be consumed in the iniquity of the city. That phrase, which are here, does anyone have a note in your center margin for that? Bingo. Which are found. Which are found. It seems to suggest that others, sadly, were lost. And as the narrative plays out, we see this true from a spiritual perspective. Some of them were lost, and some were lost for good. That phrase, lest thou be consumed, it reveals to Lot a very specific and important principle. It's the imperative that separation was required for salvation. It was one or the other. Stay and be consumed, or leave and have life. Separation was required for salvation. Young people, that's how important the principle of separation is. That's why we have to get it right in our own lives. Separation is required for salvation. That's what we see here in the life of Lot in Genesis 19. And yet we would have noticed from verse 16 that Lot lingered. It means to be reluctant, to question, to hesitate, or to tarry. Leaving this city was what Lot had preached to his house in verse 14. And yet how soon after he struggles to perform that very task. But we know that God, in his mercy, had sent 2 angels with 4 hands to lead 4 individuals from this city to safety. Behold the goodness and the severity of God. And so the men laid hold upon their hands. It means to encourage. It's the same word that's used of King Josiah before his, in 2 Chronicles 35. During the time of his Reformation, when he encouraged the people to complete the work that they had begun. The angels provided encouragement to complete this work, to separate to safety for Lot and for his family. You cannot deny that the attachment to this city would have been strong. That point can't be disputed based on a verse like this. They're literally being grabbed to ensure that they walk out alive. And certainly as you read in the end of verse 16, God was merciful to Lot and to his house. The word merciful, it means compassion, gentleness. It's a Hebrew word that's only used 2 times in all of the Old Testament. This word for merciful, that God was merciful to Lot. It's used here in Genesis 19, and the other reference, we'll turn to it, is Isaiah 63. Let's just read the section that speaks about the mercy of our God. Isaiah 63, we're going to begin in verse 7. And the same Hebrew word is going to come up in verse 9. It's the word pity. Verse 7, it says, I will mention the loving kindness of the Lord and the praises of the Lord according to all that the Lord hath bestowed on us, the great goodness toward the house of Israel, which he has bestowed on them according to his mercies and according to the multitude of his loving kindnesses. For he said, surely they are my people, children that will not lie, so he was their Savior. In all their affliction he was afflicted, and the angel of his presence saved them. In his love and in his pity he redeemed them, and he bare them and he carried them all the days of old. This too was the mercy that was bestowed upon Lot and his family to escape this wicked city. It was a pattern that was set out when the angels first appeared to Abram, when they showed up to meet with Abram at his tent door. 5 times we see God's response that I will not, he said to Abram. 5 times the mercy of God was shown. I will not destroy. I will not destroy. You know, Lot had left Abraham in Genesis 13 and verse 5 as a wealthy man. And now in Genesis 19, he leaves Sodom destitute of any riches. What a powerful example for us. Because the world can have the very same effect on each one of us. It can rob us of our wealth, both material, but more importantly, spiritual. There may be times in our lives when we think, I just need a break from life and the truth. It's too much today. It's been a tough month, a tough year. I just need a rest. Young people, don't ever forget, the world never rests. It never takes a break. And Sodom never rested. It took the hands of angels, the mercy of God, to bring Lot and his wife and his 2 daughters out of the city. And having considered Lot in these verses, we're struck with the apparent contrast to Abraham in Genesis chapter 18. And what we see come forward is really an illustration of the results of our decisions. Because we were introduced in chapter 18 and chapter 19 in much the same way. Very similar introductions, but of course, because of their previous decisions, we see 2 very different results. They're both sitting, one in a tent door, the other in a gate. They both bow down when they see the men approach. They both show hospitality. A meal is prepared for both. And then the change starts to occur. Because Abraham was off on his own as a stranger and a pilgrim. The young man that was helping him was certainly shown to be very helpful. But the young men that came to Lot's house were there for terrible reasons. We see in verse 10 there was a message of wonderful hope given to Abraham and to Sarah, yet a message of destruction to Lot and to his family. Abraham goes out with the angels, leading them on their way, whereas Lot lingered to follow them. And then Abraham was able to return to his house as he lived a separate life. Lot could never return to the place he called home. And the overarching verse for all of this is verse 14 in chapter 18. Is there anything too hard for the Lord? See, what we're seeing is that God, in both situations, is still at work. And that has to give us comfort. Young people, we should never forget that God's will be done regardless of if you and I are doing it. But God was still at work in both of these men's lives. So just to conclude, what then are the exhortations for us? What are the first 16 verses of Genesis 19 reveal to us that we should contemplate and think about our own lives? Firstly, we recall the events of Genesis chapter 14 and the rescue of Lot by Abram. And how, having been brought out of Sodom, knowing what this city was like, Lot still decides to go back down to Sodom. And the lesson here, young people, is that while God was intervening in the life of Lot, Lot still chose to go back. And perhaps in our own lives, there will be times when God shuts the door and we try to find a window instead. Lot, of course, his name means a covering or a veil, and at times he was spiritually blurred. There's a saying on Lot that though he was worldly enough to live in Sodom, he was righteous enough to loathe its ways. And so we ask ourselves, can we at times become blurred in our spiritual vision to where we think the environment we're in won't affect us? The decisions are not as serious because I can overcome it. I'm strong enough. There's many examples that we could look to. A decision to move yourself, perhaps your family, into isolation. A decision as young people to take part in the events of the world around us. A decision to not attend a Bible school or a study day. Let's work hard to keep the vision clear in our minds so we don't lose sight of what is to come. We see from Lot that we have to be able to have the foresight to see what our decisions and our choices may cost. We need to take a lesson here from Lot, whose decline we have recorded for us. We have to think long-term with our decisions. We need to watch and to learn from events in our own lives, and always turn to God in prayer. And just a helpful acronym that I came across is we need to turn to God ASAP. What it stands for is just always say a prayer. And there's just a neat quote that God may put us flat on our back before we're finally in a position to look up at Him. Go to God in prayer. That's the lesson we get from Philippians 4 and verse 6. In everything, by prayer, go to God. So let us recognize the goodness and the mercy of our God, and let us act upon it. We have the Father's character stated in principle in Exodus 34 for us. He is very good, very merciful, that He is gracious, and we see it here in action in Genesis 19. So young people, let's remember that grace isn't an excuse to do what's wrong, but God's grace is an encouragement to do what's right. So we leave this section then with Lot, with his wife, and with his two daughters, seemingly headed off to safety, headed off to start a God-centered life somewhere else. But as we're going to see tomorrow night, sadly, the influence of Sodom is not that easy to forget. You can take people out of Sodom, but you can't always take Sodom out of the people.